Well, we spoke earlier in the week about the calculation that that China was gearing up to interfere in the American election next year. Now, here in this British government reply to this important select committee, they say a special unit in the British government has been set up to tackle the threat of election interference here. What do you think that unit will be doing, and what do you think, Isabel, it needs to be doing?
Well, I guess one thing, a rather clear thing it needs to be doing is monitoring any kind of financial transactions. I mean, we can learn in some ways from Australia, which went through this many years ago when it started looking at the degree of Chinese influence in domestic politics in Australia, and it worked in a number of ways. It worked for, support for parties and candidates who were sympathetic to the Chinese line. I'm really couldn't tell you which party the Chinese government would favour in UK elections, but certainly in terms of individuals, you can imagine that it would be supporting people who took a more sympathetic view than others. But I think the harder thing is the way we get our news now, which is largely on social media, and again, as we've discussed, there's been a huge uptick in very dubious accounts and the use of bots to push Chinese perspectives and to push Chinese political views. That is, as we've discovered in recent years, much harder to track and to evaluate. And I would hope it's something that Rishi Sunak will be raising with the companies when he has his cyber security, his cyber and AI summit this autumn.
Yes.
Because the algorithms operated by these companies do very little, really to police this and need to be changed.
Yeah, and the sophistication of Chinese efforts to disseminate fake news is really truly remarkable. And when you apply that to a political mission, even if it's a mission not to elect one side or a blue or a red government, because it's hard to see what they would wish to see when it comes to that choice, but they would certainly wish to disrupt the process and undermine faith just in our democratic system. And meanwhile, we see the government accepting that China has been using the word headhunting for people in influential positions or with access to people in influential positions. We could have anticipated that was possible, but it is a serious matter. I mean, not least because China is, of course, willing and able to write very big checks to get people on side.
It is, and again, it's. I guess it's a question of where you draw the line. Is it, for example, the Chinese, set up its own multilateral bank. It has British representatives, working for the bank or on the board. I mean, you can imagine that a set of institutions in which you might want to cooperate or might not want to cooperate, where do you draw the line between cooperating with China, sometimes for remuneration, and acting as an agent of influence for China, again, for remuneration? Now, clearly, we had the case last year of a Chinese lawyer who was never charged, actually, or a lawyer of Chinese origin, who was regarded as an agent of influence and who had financed a researcher in the office of a Labour MP. Now, I would have thought that was a very large red flag. At the time, it appeared to break no law, but it's clearly an influence operation.
Yeah.
And you have in the House of Lords, I mean, I would go through the House of Lords and say, okay, who has, served on Chinese entities or Chinese boards? Who's on the board of Huawei? What do you say about being on the board of Huawei and a remunerated position?
Yes. And
there are a lot of Brits who work for Huawei. So,
yes,
we're going to have to start thinking about this in a rather more granular way.
Indeed. And again, more dilemma. Where do you draw the line between contracts, business with China that you're happy to see take place, by way of buying equipment, selling equipment, involvement of China in big projects, and where is that simply too risky? Where do you draw the line when it comes to investment or involvement of China in critical infrastructure?
Well, that's the kind of scrutiny that I think the committee has complained simply wasn't being done. So, for example, there was a lot of mention of civil nuclear power. And as you know, the Chinese put money into Hinkley Point C, and the quid pro quo was that they would build and operate a nuclear power station on the British system in Bradwell. Now, that seems, again, to me to be full of red flags. That hasn't quite been cancelled. There's obviously a lot more discussion about it now than there was when it was agreed by David Cameron and George Osborne. But, that is absolutely critical national infrastructure. Now, the previous occasion, which was also the subject of an absolutely blistering report from the same committee, was how Huawei came to be part of British Telecoms. And that was a catalogue of indifference and a company which had been subsidized to undercut the competition, eventually driving a lot of the competition out of business. So leaving Huawei as effectively one of three companies worldwide who were capable of supplying 5G. And in terms of the other kind of resilience on national networks, you want to have three suppliers. So we were left in a dilemma. We already had Huawei equipment right through the system. And when it came to 5G, which is going to be far more important, what do? There are only three suppliers, partly because we gave them and other governments gave them enormous contracts. Now, that was the kind of insouciance and indifference. And people BT did try to get government attention to this danger before they assigned the contract, and they didn't get a response. So I think that wouldn't happen now. We have screening mechanisms both for inward investment and for thinking about the kind of contracting that we do, but we have at the same time created really quite important dependencies on Chinese supply chains. So, for example, one thing coming down the track are electric vehicles. Now, there was a report recently on the danger from the Internet of Things. So things like, your domestic appliances now talk to you. They now sort of collect information about you. Where does that go? And who might be benefiting from it? Look at electric vehicles. We're about to be swamped with electric vehicles, which have a mass of data collection within them. Every electric vehicle, has a whole collection of onboard computers that could be listening to your conversation in the car. They certainly will know where you've been. They'll know, what your habits are. If you were associated with government in any way or with sensitive areas of security, would you feel comfortable with that vehicle was a Chinese one? Would you know where that data was going?
Yes.
So I think, there are a whole load of things that we're just going to have to think about very hard, because the frontiers of technology are moving very fast, and China is sitting, in an advanced part of those frontiers.